In this video, we're going to be practicing proving that triangles are congruent using the hypotenuse leg theorem. But before we do that, let's just review these vocabulary terms. In a right triangle, the legs, remember, are the sides that are adjacent or next to the right angle. So you can see in this right triangle on the right here, the two legs are the shorter sides. They are the sides that are next to your right angle. The hypotenuse is the side opposite the right angle. It's the longest side of your triangle. It's important to know where these are because you need to know when you're finding congruent pieces, if you're finding a congruent leg or you're finding a congruent hypotenuse. And so the hypotenuse leg congruence theorem states that if you have a right triangle where one leg is congruent to the other leg of another right triangle, and the hypotenuse of the first triangle is congruent to the hypotenuse of the second triangle, then you know your two triangles are congruent. Now remember, this theorem only works for right triangles. And so don't try to use this theorem if you don't see that you are working with right angles in your triangles. So we're going to go ahead and open up our proof workbook, and we're going to look at our hypotenuse leg proof number 1 theorem on page 9. All right, we are given that triangle QSR and triangle TSR are right triangles. I'm going to go ahead and make that my very first given. And so if we look at our two triangles, we can tell that these are going to be the right angles that make a right triangle. So this already kind of gives us a hint that we're going to need to possibly use our hypotenuse leg theorem because we're working with right triangles. We are also given that line segment QS is congruent to line segment TS. And so right now, when I'm looking at my picture, these two segments in both of these triangles, these are across from the right angle. So these sides would be the hypotenuse. So right now, we know that the hypotenuse in each of the triangles, those are congruent. And so all we need now is to figure out if one of the legs in our two triangles are congruent. So when I go ahead and I look at my picture, I notice that these two triangles share a side. They share line segment SR. Well, if they share that side has to be congruent to itself. Line segment SR is congruent to line segment SR. That's the reflexive property. Looking at these two right triangles, we have just shown that one of the legs is congruent. And so because these are right triangles and we have a hypotenuse and a leg that is congruent in both triangles, we're now ready to state that the two triangles are congruent. So triangle QSR is congruent to triangle TSR. And that is by the hypotenuse leg congruence theorem. We're going to go ahead and do the second hypotenuse leg proof on page 10. Okay, so our first statement that's given to us is that line segment PR is perpendicular to line segment QR. And so if we look at the picture, if PR, line segment PR, is perpendicular to line segment SQ, that tells you that these two angles are right angles. I added that in my picture. I'm going to make sure I add that in my proof. Angle PRQ and angle PRS are right angles. And that's important because that tells us that we're working with a right triangle here. Now there's an extra step that technically we don't really need, but we're going to add it in here just because it's part of our word bank and I don't want to confuse anybody. If these are both right angles, we know that they're congruent, right? So, oops, I'm not filling in my reasons. This was given, and I knew they were right angles because that's the definition of perpendicular lines. And anyway, this isn't a necessary step, but I'm going to add it in here. Angle PRQ is congruent to angle PRS. And that's because all right angles are congruent. You technically didn't need this to be able to do the proof, but I just added it in here. All right, our next given that I haven't used yet is line segment PQ is congruent to line segment PS. That is given. I'm going to put that in my proof. And so looking at my picture, here are my two right angles. These two sides are the hypotenuse of each right triangle. So in order to use the hypotenuse leg theorem, we just have to find one of the legs that are congruent. If I look in the picture, they share this side. Line segment PR is shared by both right triangles. So line segment PR has to be congruent to itself by the reflexive property. So we have just shown that a leg is congruent in both triangles. So since we're working with two right triangles and we have a hypotenuse and a leg, we are now ready to state that the two triangles are congruent by the hypotenuse leg congruence theorem.